Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you enjoyed the lunch and that you're ready for a pleasant afternoon discussing another competition law and policy topics. So it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce you Professor Frédéric, who has kindly accepted to do this fireside chat with me here at the Lisbon conference. As you all know, Professor Geny is an emeritus professor of economics at the ESSEC Business School in Paris and was previously chairman of the OECD Competition Committee for 13 years. He was also judge of the French Supreme Court, la Cour de la Cassation. He was the first economist to be judge at the Cour de Cassation between 2004 and 2012. He was non-executive director of the Office of Fair Trading in the UK between 2007 and 2014, vice president of the French Competition Authority between 1993 to 2004, and president of the WTO Working Group on Trade and Competition between 1994 to 2003. He holds a PhD in economics from the Harvard University, a doctorate in economics from the University of Paris, and an MBA degree from the ESSEC Business School, also in Paris. Professor Geny has written extensively about trade, competition, and economic development, and has served as an advisor for many developing countries worldwide. He has done an extensive and impressive career both as a scholar and economics professor, but also as an experienced enforcer and a judge. So our aim is to have an open conversation to hear Professor Geny's valuable insights about the state of play in the competition world in the face of the current international context. So, Professor Geny and Fred, if I may, thank you so much for agreeing to do this fireside chat with me. It's really a pleasure. So the first thing I would like to understand is, though, Professor Geny, you have an extensive curriculum in terms of economics. You're a well-known, recognized professor of economics worldwide. You're at the Lisbon conference. You're being interviewed by me. We had Philippe Aguillon in the morning. You know what happened. What are your plans for October 2026 after being interviewed by me? Any expectations?
Wait for you to deliver.
I can call the Norwegian committee. And we have good relations in Portugal. No, but more seriously, let's start with some discussions with you. As we've been discussing this morning, the recent industrial policy and protectionist waves that are coming from the US call us upon to ask how best to fine-tune our competition policies and combine them with other public policies, namely our trade and industrial strategies, in order to ensure optimal outcomes for markets and consumers. So in this context, I would like to start by asking you, how do you look at the current state of play in Western industrial policies in relation to competition? Do you think they are pro-competitive or anti-competitive policies?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. And also, of course, your question goes back to a few things which are discussed this morning in a very interesting way. To answer directly your question, I can't answer. Because it seems to me that they are complementary, and which is neither pro nor anti-competitive. So I want to go back a little bit on the panel that we had just before lunch, because I wanted to make a point, which is the following. When I think about industrial policies, I think that there are two types that one can have. One of them is to try to correct market failures, either due to lack of coordination or due to some externality. And I will come back on the notion of externality. And the second one is more dynamic, to get the economy growing and innovative. So there are two sets, really, one more dynamic, I would say, than the other one. The first one doesn't create a problem with competition policy or competition law because precisely it tries to address failures of the competitive process. Then when we think about the instruments, we have two sets of instruments when we look at the relationship between industrial policy and competition policy. A lot of discussion this morning went on how to make industrial policy instrument more consistent with competition, more respectful of competition, and I think that this is really important, and a lot was said this morning. But there's a second set of instruments, which is competition law enforcement and competition policy instruments. And I think that the real big question is how do we make competition law instruments more consistent with the dynamic industrial policy, with innovation and growth. And that is a mirror question of the one that was discussed mostly this morning, which is a much more difficult question, really. The second point I wanted to make is when we think about market failures, I think we have to make a distinction between the technical market failures, I said externalities, for example, positive or negative, and what I would call socio-political externalities. All of a sudden, we're worried about the future generations. And the utility of people in future generation enters our own utility. And we realize that competition as we practice it may be disruptive in the sense that it depletes the possibilities for future generation to benefit. It is an externality because we have changed our perspective on the world. Okay, so that was created by a change of mindset, I would say. It's technical because once you have this in your utility function, you have to deal with it. Now, globalization and competition policy have always been sold at a political level as being a win-win game. Well, the thing is a win-win game possibly, but also there may be losers. The losers may be the consumers tomorrow, there may be some consumers today or some industries which are going to go down. And for those disruptions, recently, we've had an increased awareness of the fact that there were those negative externalities, for example, on sustainability, but also on strategic independence or on resilience. So what didn't bother us yesterday now bothers us, is becoming an externality, and we have to try, as competition authority, to integrate this into a framework.
We have to bring those externalities for our daily work in order to incorporate them in our cases, in our merger control.
Right. My main point is that we have to think about how we can adjust our instruments to deal with the industrial policy objectives, either dynamic or the social-political ones I have mentioned.
Yes. In a recent paper that you've published entitled European Industrial Policy, A Challenge and a Chance for Competition Policy, you mentioned that we have to learn from the past. There were some lessons learned from both sides of the Atlantic, both in the US and the EU, that we can take into account when dealing with this new industrial policy. What lessons do you think we should have learned from the past in order to improve our future?
Okay, there are a number of lessons. Some of them have been alluded to this morning. To take something very simple, which is the fact that competition is a necessary dimension, but not sufficient, clearly. So what we've learned is that we've had a very active competition policy, but increase in productivity didn't show up, or innovation didn't show up, because there was something else missing. Okay. So first thing that we've learned is that competition policy has to work with other policies, and that are going to. It doesn't mean that competition policy is not contributing to innovation or contributing to, but it means that it needs a complementary set of policies to have the effect that we expect. So I think that this is one of the lessons. The second one, which is maybe the most important one, is the fact that because competition policy has been quite successful, we have caught up on a number of misallocations, and this has helped us grow. But there's a limit to what you can achieve this way. And as I think that Mr. Aguillon was saying this morning, we're now in a world where it seems that growth is going to come from innovation. So that creates a question, which is what is the relationship between competition and innovation? I've got the utmost respect for Mr. Aguillon, and as well as for Arrow and Schumpeter. The question is, do they provide us with a practical way to deal with a merger when we have a merger, and when we ask ourselves, is this merger going to contribute to innovation or restrict competition? And there, I think that we really need to have a better framework and a more consistent framework to deal with those issues. The third thing, which was mentioned this morning, is the fact that by comparing industrial policies that were implemented in different parts of the world, we saw that some of them were successful and the same one were a failure in some other countries. And this helped us, and there's quite a bit of literature on this, understand why it was. I'll take just one example, which is the fact that both Korea and Brazil, for example, had industrial policy of protecting their domestic market. It worked pretty well in Korea, didn't work very well in Brazil. There was one big difference between the two, which was that the subsidies for the protected firms, the chaebols in Korea, were a function of their performance on international markets. So that kept them an incentive to become as efficient as possible and to improve. The same policy without the subsidy being indexed on the success at the international level happened in Brazil and in several countries in Latin America, didn't lead to the same result. Okay. So we've learned quite a bit on this, and I'm not going to repeat what was said this morning, but it's very clear that keeping the competition incentive is in the instrument is very important.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned that example of the interplay between trade policy and competition policy in both those countries, South Korea and Brazil, with different outcomes.
But in a sense, you can have a restrictive trade policy, and the idea there is that there are sometimes economies at the industry level and increasing returns at the industry level, in which case it's good to make your industry grow so that it can benefit from those. But if you do this without minding for an incentive for them to not only benefit from the protection, but also to keep their productivity at the highest possible level, then you don't get the same result in the end.
Coming back to Europe, what Draghi points out at his report is the need that Europe has for innovation. There's a lack of innovation in Europe. So what do you think is the role of the competition authorities in this context to foster and protect innovation? How can we, in our daily work as authorities, try to protect innovation, namely in the context of merger control?
If I were to finish on the lessons, because there's one more, which has been alluded to this morning. Can you think of an innovation, which is very much talked about today, which was not born out of an industrial policy project? If you think about batteries, if you think about mRNAs, if you think about the jet engine, if you think about the computer, if you think about everything. So one thing that we learned is that industrial policy is useful because it has promoted quite a bit of innovation. It was not the only element, but it was also a crucial element. Okay. So now what can competition authorities do for that? To me, the most urgent thing that they need to do is to try to come up with a framework two things. To come up with a framework of the relationship between competition and innovation that could be translated into guidelines on how they will look at the innovation dimension of, let's say, a merger. What are the questions? And second, what do they expect from the parties if the party wants to argue that they have innovation benefits associated with the merger? We don't have this. Okay. That's not necessarily the fault of competition authorities. It's the fault of economists, really, because they haven't really given us enough to have something which is clear, coherent, and can be used. It can be done, but it should be done very rapidly. The second thing is, I think, at least in Europe, we have to think about the standard of proof somewhere. There is a tension between the fact that when you look at a merger, the competition authority asks themselves whether it's more likely than not that this merger is going to lead to either a restriction in competition or a restriction in innovation. When we look at the innovation defense, we use a different standard because we want those innovations that are predicted to be verifiable and quantifiable. And by definition, they haven't taken place at the time of the merger. So it's nearly an impossible proof. And there, we may, in fact, fall into what Frank Easterbrook in the early 90s was saying. If you allow a merger which is going to reduce prices by 5%, if you block a merger that is going to be lower the price but increase the price but lower innovation, because innovation is a cumulative process, you may make a big mistake. So I think that we have standard of proof which are misaligned. It doesn't mean that we should have complete reversal, but at least we have a real tension there that we have to deal with. The third thing is for competition authority to have more of a longer time perspective in their analysis. And this is not only in the future. This has started, for example, if you take the Dow-DuPont merger decision in the EC, I mean, there was but it's also in the analysis of the past. In other words, it's not necessarily the market share at the time of the merger, which is important. It may be the dynamic of innovation in the industry the last 5 years or 6 years that tells you something about what is progressing or being developed and is likely to succeed. Finally, basing myself on the commentaries that we've had about the Dow-DuPont merger, which have been, it's quite clear that competition authorities have already, and I think there's one particular example, which is the Japanese, the JFTC's, Japanese competition authorities, has in fact made quite a bit of effort to say, well, if we think about how incentives are going to be changed by a merger in terms of innovation, there are more influences than the ones that have been recognized in the Dow-DuPont. On the one hand, you're going to have higher margins, so that's going possibly to push you towards having more profit, and therefore, on the other hand, you're going to have lower quantity because you're going to have more market power, so that's going to... So the first thing is to identify all the effects, which go in different directions, and try to get a sense of... The second one is the fact that there is a divide in our profession between the business school economists and the competition economists, and they don't talk to each other, and they despise each other, largely. We, because we think that they are agents of business firms, and they, because they think that we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about business strategy. But it seems to me that some of the work which has been done on considering capacities as a complement to the analysis of incentive is also quite useful. So I think if we have, those four things, a better theory and a framework written and for thinking about the relationship between innovation and competition, a slightly extended time perspective. Part of this is because innovations in particular don't take necessarily the same time in different industries. So maybe you want to adjust the analysis to what is realistic for the industry. The final point is also to look at the complements to competition that could make competition work better in the particular circumstances. As we said earlier, I mean, there's complement between competition policy and other set, and maybe we don't look at those other circumstances sufficiently in detail to know whether competition is actually going to deliver in terms of innovation.
I think what it is just a great contribution for the debate around the EU merger guidelines that it's ongoing nowadays. So we have many people from the DG come here and from the authorities, and that I think that was a wonderful contribution. Now, Fred, another hot topic nowadays is the European champions and the need to have European champions. Some voices say that European competition laws and authorities have been in the way of economic growth in Europe and in the formation of the European champions. What do you think is the role of competition authorities in this context?
Well, I don't know what the role of competition authorities is. I like European champions if the European champion has emerged because barriers to trade have been eliminated and because a sensible innovation policy has been implemented, which has led the firm to become very productive and innovative. So European champion in itself is neither a positive nor a negative. There are positive European champions. And on the opposite side, of course, it's very different if the European champion has been created by protectionist policies and no attempt really to improve the quality of the European champion. So I think that competition authorities use the word European champions a little bit in a derogatory way, but they should not, because champions in itself is neutral. Second, I think that industrial policy has evolved considerably. The industrial policy that we have today, and then I will talk a little bit about IPCEI and ARPA type of policy, those are quite different from the tendency that existed in the 70s and the 80s to create champions through protectionist means. Now we are in a completely different type of industrial policy. And finally, I want to say that I don't think that the Draghi report really is something that we should worry about from that point of view, because if you read the Draghi report, in fact, Draghi says he's very critical of the national champions, which have been created in Europe and which prevent the market from being unified and therefore the scale from being sufficient, leads to fragmentation. So he's certainly not advocating this.
Okay, moving to another topic, you have been actively contributing to the development of competition policies worldwide. So you know a lot about international cooperation. So what's your outlook about the future of international cooperation, where nowadays issues are becoming to be more and more regional or in a global way? I'm thinking about cross-border cartels, I'm thinking of international mergers. Do you believe that international cooperation between competition authorities has been used to its full potential to safeguard innovation, economic growth, and competitive markets?
We're talking about cooperation on cases here. Okay, I'm going to limit myself mostly to that. And I think there are three dimensions which are important. One of them is, or three questions rather, that you're asking. The first one is, have we cooperated as much as we should have, or we could have in the past? The second one is, does it make a difference that now innovation has become a really important consideration in merger control for the reasons that we've mentioned before? And does that change anything about the kind of cooperation or the intensity of cooperation we should have? And there may be a third one, which is the digital sector, whether there's a particular issue in the digital sector for cooperation. So on the first question, I'm not going to be very original because the OECD and the ICN have made surveys regularly. I mean, there have been several surveys of competition authorities, both from OECD and from the ICN, so a very large sample. And the answer stays the same survey after survey. One, cooperation is usually, on cases, is usually important. We like it, but there's not enough of it. And when you go into why is it that there's not enough of it, you have a set of issues. First of all, the fact that it's voluntary, and so some countries don't particularly want to cooperate. Okay, so that's one problem, in particular for small jurisdictions or competition authorities in small jurisdictions. But there are also other technical differences in legal frameworks or differences in time schedule for reviewing mergers. Okay. So first thing, cooperation is very useful. We have not cooperated as much as competition authority would have liked. Second thing, if we think now about what does innovation make a difference to this? I think, yes. The fact that innovation has become so important for growth and that mergers are looked at not only from the point of view of whether they restrict competition, but also whether they promote innovation or restrict innovation, has introduced a public dimension in the merger. In other words, the same merger, when it's looked by several different countries, if one of them decide that it's going to block the merger when the others think that it would have promoted innovation, it means that those other countries are literally going to be the victim of the decision of the first. So that's a very powerful call for cooperating between competition authorities whenever the issue of innovation is an important issue for a merger, because you don't want any country can block, I mean, any sufficiently large country could block a merger worldwide, and this would create an externality for the other countries.
If the jurisdictions have the same power, the authorities are at the same level, because if you deal with different jurisdictions with different powers, you know.
But that would call for reinforcing really innovation in cooperation in cases of innovation issues. And the third level, which is what about the digital sector? Okay. Now, the digital sector, there we may make a difference between the global platforms and the national platforms. I don't have anything to say about the national platforms, but the global platforms, they set policies at the global level. Okay? Then we have a set of competition authority, each of which has a very limited geographical jurisdiction. The results are two levels. First of all, duplication. Now, if I take the price parity clause of Booking.com, and I don't have an extensive list, but it's been looked at in Australia, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, it's always the same price parity clause which is examined. Okay. And there's a real question there. Do we need all those investigations? Isn't there a terrible waste of time, waste of resources? Okay. If I take, I don't know, if I take the Apple Pay, I mean, I could say the same thing, or the Google Media thing. Okay. So those cases are expensive cases for competition authorities. They are much likely, very likely, going to raise exactly the same issues from one country with minimal changes. Real question is, isn't there a better way to organize ourselves than having this repetition of decisions with full investigation at the national level? The answer is, I mean, we did have at the OECD a panel with other regulators, economic regulators. So that went from criminal prosecutors to banks to, I mean, all kinds of economic regulators. What was very clear is that competition authority cooperate much less than those other regulators. They don't have the framework that allows joint investigation or lead authority or adopting the decision of another, whereas those framework exist in other part of. So first, waste of time, waste of resources to arrive at a result which is not quite as good. So competition authorities, of course, are very mindful of their resources. So what they say is that, oh, well, you know, I would really like to have an ex-ante regulation because the ex-post cases are very expensive and very slow. And okay. So rather than cooperating, let's say, on an investigation, deciding to launch an investigation, and then everybody chips in what they think is important, and then after the joint investigation has been done, every country can make its own decision. But that saves a lot of resources. Instead of this, we'll rush into another direction, which is what about having an ex-ante regulation, because that will solve the problem. But the ex-ante regulation is something which I think can be dangerous.
Are you thinking about the DMA?
I won't quote any name. No, I mean, there's DMA, but there are many variants in many countries. So I think there's a better way to organize ourselves, and that cooperation at different level, it may be just on the basic investigation, it may be on the recognition of the decision in another. For example, I've seen that in Australia, there are a couple of decisions which have been taken where essentially the competition authority, the CCC, only looked at whether the remedy which had been imposed in Europe was working for Australia. Okay, so that's the beginning of a cooperation, but I think that we need much more than what we have.
So there's still a way to go in that area.
Yeah.
But
And so we had a round table and so therefore there is a document at OECD of how in taxes, in money laundering, etc., how regulators cooperate, and that gives plenty of ideas about what could be adopted. Yeah.
International cooperation rules. Okay, Fred, so we have time for just one last question, which is regarding the interplay between digital markets and competition policy. You mentioned this April at a workshop on future of antitrust enforcement that there is a need for competition authorities to adapt their economic thinking, namely to address competition issues raised by digital markets. So in your view, how can enforcers adapt more swiftly to these new dynamics that were brought by digital markets?
Well, two dimensions. One of them we've already talked about, which is innovation, because competition is through innovation, so we're back to... But the second one, what is really striking to me is that competition between platforms is a competition between baskets of services which are complementary in each basket, but differentiated from one basket to another. This is very different from competition between firms that all do the same product and try to sell it cheaper or to have lower cost. I know that some economists are working on trying to develop a scenario, I mean, a theory of harm in the case of this kind of competition. But I think that we really need this to be able to deal intelligently with some of the problems that we find on platforms. One of the things, for example, that is very obvious is that thinking in terms of relevant market when competition is between baskets of services doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, the ecosystem.
Second thing is the fact that if you are a technology which allows you to offer a variety of services, you're very mobile across markets. So potential competition may come from people who are doing things which are entirely different from what you do. So I think that we need to have a framework which is more adapted to the logic of digital competition, and that yet haven't seen that happen very much in the case of competition authority. I mean, we have made progress. For example, there was a time when we had a difficult time understanding multi-sided markets. I think that we've passed this. But the next step is really to have this, and I think that hope is on the way, because there are economists who are working on this, yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. We don't have time for more. As always, it was wonderful to speak with you, Fred. An amazing talk, really. A lot to think about. So please join me in the round of applause to Professor Frédéric and Yves.
I look forward to October 26th.
Yeah, we can speak in October 26th. I will interview once again. Thank you.